Welcome to this week's presentation on qualitative research, chapter 19 in your textbook. Obviously, I'm not Jim Ave. My name is Chris Fisher. I finished this master's program last year, and Jim asked me if I would go over the material in this chapter for you guys because my project or study was all based on qualitative research. So I'm hoping to go over some of the highlights for you and then offer some personal insight about what I had to work through during this process. It is different than quantitative, and I asked Jim if any of you were doing any qualitative, and it looks like at this point not too many, if any of you are. So I'm just going to give you some key ideas, some key concepts, just to kind of show you the differences. Also, if any of you decide to do a little qualitative in your study or project, please contact me. Jim has my contact information. I'd be more than happy to help you guys. I, like you, am also very busy this time of year, especially if you're a coach. We're starting our season. But if you give me some heads up, I'd be more than happy to help you guys get through or offer advice and help you through anything I can. The resources used for this presentation, the first book is by Cresswell. I highly recommend that whether you're doing quantitative or qualitative, you use this book as a resource. Jim has it with him. I found this book to be extremely useful. It has a lot of information that the textbook doesn't cover, and it goes a little bit more in depth into certain things. And I think you'll find it very helpful no matter what style you're using. And then the second book up there is obviously your normal textbook that you have been using so far. The objectives for this presentation are broken up into two parts, basically for downloading purposes. So in part one, we're going to describe and discuss the differences between qualitative and quantitative research. And we're also going to describe and discuss some qualitative research designs. In part two, we're going to look more at the procedures in qualitative research, as well as the analysis of the data, the collecting of it, how to sort it and categorize it. And then you're also going to describe how to determine the trustworthiness of qualitative research, which for me, that was some of those things were very different from what I had been studying with quantitative in the classwork up to this point. Okay, let's do just a little review on quantitative research designs, some of the characteristics of it before we get into qualitative. The root word for quantitative is quantity. So obviously we're talking about numbers. Numeric values represent quantity. They're used to compare participants from one to another. For example, you have weight, height, cholesterol level, percentages, scale ranges, that kind of stuff. What's ironic to me about this is that in the process, the steps for research, in quantitative research, your literature review plays a major role. So even though your research is being compared, measured, justified with numbers, your literature review, which is words, is going to justify the research problem and kind of give you your need for direction in that. But like I said, the key here is the term quantity, numbers. You're going to collect data using instruments, and you're going to measure the variables in the study. The analysis, you're going to use statistics. And I don't know if Jim's got into that yet, but there's various types of statistics you'll use, mathematical procedures to compare your groups, relate your variables. The information that you get from these measurements, these numbers, they're going to provide information on how to address or look at the research questions or your hypothesis. And you're going to interpret these results, and in this interpretation is basically an explanation as to why your results came out the way they did, and you'll often use words to all write this up. So it's kind of ironic. Like I said, you go from words to numbers to words. Little background on quantitative research designs, just to kind of go backwards a little bit. Different types of quantitative research. First up, experimental. You have your true and your quasi. Remember, your true is where your researcher will randomly assign participants to different conditions, and the individuals in the experimental group receive experimental treatment while the people in the control group do not. Whereas in quasi, there's assignments but not random assignments of participants to group. This is because usually, like I said, the experimenter, you can't artificially create the groups for the experiment. Survey research is another popular form of quantitative research. Remember, survey research is primarily used in education and behavioral sciences, and you're hoping that problems can be solved and practices improved through this method. The survey is probably the most common type of descriptive research method. Now on the slide I had the two terms backwards. I do apologize. And in the survey, it's a technique of, that seeks to determine practices and, to determine present practices and opinions of a certain population. And then you use this in the form of a questionnaire or an interview or a normative survey, which is the third one in descriptive. And you're trying to make things better for that particular population. See if you can improve the workplace. See if you can improve the overall maybe cohesion of a team. And the last one on here is epidemiological research. And these are used, methods are used primarily in public health endeavors, health-related events. You're trying to look at frequency and patterns, I think, in the health type field. So those are the four types that I think you guys have covered with Jim so far. The root word for qualitative research is quality. And for me, this is where I started to get a little bit confused when I first started looking at things. Everything is going to be associated with words. All of your data, everything you're trying to understand is coming from words. In quantitative, they're looking at taking apart and examining things, looking at numbers and all that stuff. Whereas in qualitative, you're trying to understand the meaning of the experience, like kind of get more into their thoughts about things. So obviously this isn't going to be easily represented with numbers. So it's going to be very descriptive in nature. A lot of writing, a lot of words, looking at what they write to you, understanding what that means. Because words are used to describe the views, opinions, attitudes, and experiences of the participants. So there's several different ways you're going to be able to gather this data, which we'll go into later, and you're going to see that words become a very important part of analyzing, understanding, and explaining the phenomenon that you're looking at. Qualitative research attempts to understand a phenomenon that can first provide useful information. So in my study, I was trying to understand how writing would have an effect on basketball players. Would it help them learn material? Would it help them understand changes we were making? Would it reinforce what we were trying to work on the court? It also helps people learn about the phenomenon. In quantitative, it's just numbers, and numbers tend to be dry, bland, A plus B equals C. Whereas more in qualitative, you're trying to learn about the phenomenon from the sense that because you're getting words, because you're getting text, you're able to look at the inner thoughts, what people are saying, what they're thinking. You get to observe them more in their natural setting, and you can kind of maybe understand, how they come about and why the phenomena is what it is. And it gives a voice to the non-voiced, which means, they're kind of able to speak up. Numbers can't really tell the whole story in explaining or understanding the phenomenon, but in qualitative, it's able to do that. You're able to gain information that can help you understand what's going on. One of the big differences I found was between qualitative and quantitative was in the sampling. In qualitative research, the sampling is very purposeful and not random like in quantitative. So for example, in my study, I wanted to look at writing, the effects of writing on female community college basketball players. So it was very small and purposeful. Whereas in quantitative, if you're looking at numbers, you want to have a more random and larger sample. In quantitative, you generalize from the sample to the population. So you do your study, you gather all your data, and you apply that to the entire population. Whereas in qualitative, I'm selective. You're much more selective about the best way to help understand a specific phenomena. Because a lot of this is in the setting you're in too, which is another difference. In qualitative, you're in the natural, real-world setting. Whereas in quantitative, it's more like a laboratory. So you have very small sample sizes in qualitative, larger sample sizes in quantitative. No matter what, you still need to gain IRB approval for any of these, qualitative or quantitative. Another difference between quantitative and qualitative is inductive versus deductive reasoning. And I'll be honest, sometimes I have a hard time conceptualizing this, and so I worked on this, twisted it around, and did some things, and I'm hoping that this is the easiest way that I can explain it to you and hopefully provide an example. Deductive reasoning is used more in quantitative research. You come up with, after you do your literature reviews, you have your theory or a research question, and you have a hypothesis from this, and then you test this, and you get your results, and you have your observation, and then you confirm this or compare it against the previous literature reviews, the readings that you've done, and trying to find out, does it support the literature? Why or why not? What does it mean? How can it be used? I think the one key thing you got to focus on, it's a narrow and focused process. Then you go to inductive, which is primarily used in the qualitative research methods. And this is where it was hard for me, because you start with observations. Everything we'd been doing in the program, we were in the deductive mode. So in this, you go with the observations first. Look at what's happening around you. You start to understand, well, what does all this mean? So for me, it was, okay, I'm observing what they were writing in their journals for me. And I was looking for patterns in their writing, themes. And I had these hypotheses and ended up with my theory for my paper. This whole process is more open-ended and exploratory. And that's what was very difficult. I was used to narrowed, being very, tunnel vision, focused on this way in all my work. And then when I started to do this whole project, it was just wide open. And this was real hard for me. But once I kind of got used to it, and then, because as the kids were writing and they were doing their journals and giving feedback to me, I kept coming up with more questions and more ideas. And I kept having to rein myself back in and say, okay, let's not get too far out there. Try to stay centralized on what you're doing. And their writing reinforced what was taught on the court. So like I said, this is a difficult concept for me to grasp, and I know when I went through this with Jim, he probably did a better job of explaining it, even though he said he was confused. But really, it's just the way you come about things. They're basically reversed, is how I would look at it. There are a few types of qualitative research. The first two on the screen are ethnographic and grounded theory. They have asterisks by them because I'll go into those two in a little bit more detail. The next three, narrative, mixed methods, and biography/history. Just want to give you a very brief on that. Narrative research designs are basically used to describe lives of individuals. You would collect and tell story about people's lives and write narratives on individual experiences. The mixed methods is a type of procedure where you mix both quantitative and qualitative into a study, and it tells you how to collect the data, analyze it, and then how you would understand a research problem. The biography history is a type of narrative where it's a form of narrative in which you write and record the experience of a person's life, but the research is constructed basically from records and archives of somebody, the history, whereas in another narrative you can talk to people and get more firsthand account on them. Ethnographic research. Now, this design is used to describe, analyze, and interpret a culture sharing group's shared patterns of behavior, beliefs, and language that develop over time. Now, a definition you want to know is culture. In these terms, a culture is everything having to do with human behavior and belief. This can include language, rituals, socioeconomic structures, even political structures, stages in life, how people interact and how they communicate. Now, to understand a specific culture, the ethnographer or the researcher will spend considerable time in the field with them, interviewing, gathering data, observing how they interact, observing what they're doing in order to understand their behavior, their beliefs, and what they're doing, their language. So it's almost like you're dropped into the middle of the jungle and you're going to sit there and watch what the apes do and understand their culture. For me, since I was on the coaching staff, it was very easy for me to be in my group's culture. I was able to watch, how they were doing things, what they were saying to one another, how they were interacting, and I was able to sit there and record quality data and gain valuable insight into what I needed to know. When do you conduct an ethnography? You conduct when the study helps you understand a larger issue. So for me, I wanted to understand the effect of writing on my team. And you also conduct it when you have a culture sharing group to study. Well, the group shared the culture of being female community college basketball players. Ethnography also provides the day-to-day picture of what is happening in your group. I looked at, for me, day-to-day, how they were interacting with one another, how were they getting better at key concepts we wanted them to understand, how were their affective domains developing over time, things of those nature. And ethnographic research also provides long-term access to a culture sharing group. You can build a very detailed record of their behaviors and beliefs over a long period of time. And that's another key difference in quantitative and qualitative. You're in this for the long haul. Hey, sometimes they're years, some of these studies. Mine was, I think, about 2 months, but after doing it, I could see where I'd like to study the effects of writing over the course of an entire season, from when you first get them and until the end of the season, and see what patterns developed, what themes were coming up, and maybe use that data at the end for next year's team. Okay, here's what I learned. How can I use what I've learned for next year? There are different types of ethnographic research. The first you see is the realist ethnography, which I'll go into a little bit more detail in the next couple slides. The case study, it's a form of ethnography that differs a little. Researchers focus more on a program, event, or activity that involves the individuals rather than a group per se. It's a little bit more in-depth portion. So maybe instead of studying the effects of basketball or writing on the entire team, the effects on the team, but I'd be looking at a particular case within that, maybe more of non-regulars versus regulars. Critical ethnography is where researchers, the best way to look at it is that they're more politically minded. They're looking to make some kind of societal change. They're looking to identify and celebrate biases in research. They're looking to speak to an audience on behalf of participants. Bottom line, they're just more political in nature. The ethnographic research and the realist ethnography design. This is what I did my project study on. It's written in the third person narration. The researcher noted, for example, that player A, da-da-da-da. So you write it in the third person. The researcher reports objective data free from personal bias, goals, or judgments. This was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be, because as a coach, you develop a bond with your athletes. And so I was almost trapped in this really surreal world of, okay, here I am as a coach trying to get this team from point A to point B and do things. Yet at the same time, I'm watching them, I'm collecting information on them, observing what they do, noting them what they do, watching them on film, because I'm also using that to complete a study or project on them. It just took a lot of self-reflection, I guess is the way to kind of look back and say, okay, just stay as objective as I possibly could at all times. Also, the ethnographer produces the participants' views through closely edited quotes and has the final word on the interpretation and presentation of the culture. And what I view that as is, when it was all said and done, when I was writing my rich descriptive narrative, as you're supposed to, I found myself looking through their journals, and after I had analyzed and sorted out the themes, I was taking quotes from the journals. And I'd take those quotes, so I'd have an idea, and then here's how it was supported through these quotes. So I basically, as the researcher, as the ethnographer, did have the final word or interpretation of what this development, this pattern of commonalities ended up being, and I was able to present that in the paper as the final say of what was happening at that time, or what I thought that the participants were trying to say. So that's where it's a little bit different, or a lot different than the numbers. Numbers, it spits out a number and it's pretty cut and dry. Here it is. But with the words, you have to understand terminology, you have to understand the vocabulary, and that's why you have to gather a lot of it, because words have more than one meaning, and so you have to make sure that you're looking for the pattern. So if, let's say you're talking about, let me think, for example, in my research, I would ask them, what's something we need to do to get better on defense? And it was communication, talking to one another, helping each other on the floor. Well, if they just write about that one time, you can't really look at that and use that as something that is their view. But over time, over a long period of time, that same pattern kept occurring, so then you start to use it and look at it in those terms. Excuse me. There are some key characteristics of an ethnographic design. I'll just give a little brief description of them, help you understand it. The first you see are cultural themes. And these are just general positions that are promoted or provided by the group that you're studying. It's not to serve like a narrow portion of the study, but it becomes a broad scope that when you enter the field, you look through and you see the culture at work. You know, for me, a basketball team at work. A culture sharing group is just very simply two or more people who have a shared language, a shared belief or behavior. When you're doing ethnographic research, you're looking for, like it says, shared patterns of behavior, belief, and language. And in that you kind of need to break down a little bit. A shared pattern is just a common interaction that kind of gets the whole group focused together. I think is the best way for me to look at it. And then because of that shared pattern, they'll also have one or more of the others, the behaviors, the belief, or language. You know, belief is just an action they all take. Excuse me, that's a behavior. Behavior is just an action they all take. A belief is how they perceive things within their setting. And then language is just how they talk with one another. Fourth key characteristic is the field work. Here, the ethnographer or the researcher, you're gathering data in the setting. So you're where they are, where they're located, where they hang out. So if you're studying a classroom, you would be in the classroom. If you're studying a particular team, you're where that team goes and meets. So if it's a football team, a football field, water polo, etc. You're in their natural setting. So it's almost like that's where they feel most comfortable when they're doing whatever it is they're doing. The description, themes, and interpretation. This is where you need to be extremely detailed. Your writing is very thick. It's very rich, and it identifies specifics. I mean, you go in depth. You don't just write, I watched them hit the ball, or I watched them talk about playing defense. You need to provide the details of what they were saying. What was their body language? What were their tones of voice? How were they talking to each other? You want to be as detailed, specific as you can when you're doing your writing. The group context or setting of the group, really you can have different things. You could be a physical location of where the group is. Like I said earlier, you could be the history of them, their experience, what have they experienced. You could look at their social conditions of the individual, relationships, professions, status of professions. You could also look at, what else can I think of? Socioeconomic status, their levels, what their backgrounds are. All those play into how they formulate their own beliefs, and then within the group itself, that provides background or information on how they interact with their shared cultural beliefs. And the final key characteristic is reflexivity. Because as the researcher, you're going to make your interpretations and write your report reflexively, looking back on what you learned, the conclusions and findings. And you have to be aware and discuss your role in the study. So you want to go into the setting or the participants, and you don't want to disrupt them. You don't want to, disrupt what they do on a normally. Meaning, if you go in there and you're disruptive, they're not going to act in a natural way, act how they normally should. Because if they see someone within their setting that maybe doesn't belong there, they could provide data that's not useful for you. So you got to be careful of that as well. the grounded theory. The grounded theory is just very systematic, qualitative procedure. And what you do is you generate a theory that explains a process, action, or interaction about a topic at a very broad level, a large scope. This theory, this process theory, it explains the educational process of the events, the actions, the activities, or the interactions that occur over time. This whole process is very systematic and logical. It's kind of like, I'm trying to think of an example, would be like, let's say you want to understand like the book talks about an example of, you want to understand the process of apprehending students that have a weapon possession in a school, and what a researcher would do to explore the process, the theory behind it. The theory of apprehending students is maybe you identify people who were involved in the situation, collect the data, analyze the data looking for themes, the phenomenon, looking for processes, and you arrange them into a final product and develop your theory of the process for being apprehended. It's just very systematic is the best way to explain this. When do you use a grounded theory? You use a grounded theory when you need to generate a theory based on data. So you have data, but however, other present theories don't address a problem, or they don't address the participants that you plan to study. So you're going to generate a theory. And this is used to study the process, the action, or the interaction. And you have the data, and you develop the theory. There are three basic types of grounded theory, and they're all actually quite similar. There's the systematic design, the emerging design, and the constructivist design. Each of these designs, as stated earlier, are very similar in nature. However, the differences is they're just aligned with different people. So like the systematic design came about, and then some other people were using grounded theories, and then they developed the emerging design after the systematic. And that went along, and then you had the constructivist design, because although they liked it, the previous designs, they thought that this part should be changed. So in theory, they're all very similar, just with some minor differences. There are some key characteristics of grounded theory research. Just want to touch on those briefly so you have a little background on those. The first key characteristic is the process approach. Now, although you may want to look at a single idea or concept, you're really going to examine the process involved in how they get there is the best way to get there. Is the best way to explain it. So it's not so much as just one idea and go from A to C. It's what's the process? What was the B part? How did we get there? How did we come about that? Another characteristic is theoretical sampling. This is just very simply that the researcher is going to find ways to collect the data. They're going to be useful for the theory. Constant comparative data analysis. This seems like a mouthful, but all you're doing is just constantly comparing incidents, comparing data to other incidents. So maybe over the course of time in your study, you're looking at what are they talking about? Defensive concepts they want to focus on here, and over the time it changed to another concept. And then why did that change? That's all you're doing is comparing the data on that. The core category just basically means that you're taking a look at all the data that came, all the phenomena, or excuse me, all the categories, the themes that came in, and they're all going to be based on one core idea or concept that makes up your theory, and this core idea has to be central and related to all the other categories. That's all that is. Theory generation, it's just a very abstract explanation of the process of the topic and grounded in the data. What's that mean? This theory generation, the best way I think I can describe it is you've come up with your core category and all the other little themes that have led up to it that make it the central point. This whole process is called the grounded theory. I think that's the best way to look at it. The whole process of coming up with your core category is the basis of theory generation. And memos are just basically notes that the researcher, writes throughout the whole process, elaborate on their ideas, thoughts, code them, decode them, take them apart, look at them, looking for ways. These memos used to explain what's going on. It just kind of helped keep the researcher directed. So these are just some of the key characteristics in the grounded theory research that you would probably need to know. And that technically ends part 1 of this presentation. Hope I didn't confuse you guys more. Maybe you guys have more questions. I'd be more than happy to answer as far as some of the differences between the two. Then, like I said, in the next section, we're going to look at more of the procedures. It's a lot more simpler. How to analyze the data, how you're going to write it up. One other, difference that probably I should have touched on more is in qualitative, you just want to be more flexible. Quantitative, it's here we go, let's do it, blah, blah, blah. And in qualitative, you have to be more flexible because it is more open-ended. That was one other main struggle I had with it first, was I had to keep being flexible because I originally had an idea of what I wanted to write about. And during the course of collecting the data and looking at it and going, oh, this isn't going to work, I had to become flexible and change and modify what I was doing. So, end of part 1. Go ahead and go to part 2. And we will be done soon, and you guys can move on to your learning activity. And hopefully you have a better understanding by the end of all this of qualitative and quantitative research.